The Paracas civilization emerged along the harsh southern coastline of Peru, flourishing roughly between 800 BC and 100 BC. Their world stretched across one of the driest landscapes on Earth, centered around the Paracas Peninsula, about 250 kilometers south of modern-day Lima. Despite living in such an unforgiving environment, the Paracas people developed an advanced society. They mastered agriculture, created remarkably sophisticated textiles, and produced highly skilled ceramic art. Their woven fabrics are considered among the most impressive examples of craftsmanship from the pre-Columbian Americas. But the Paracas left behind another legacy, one that continues to generate intense debate. Archaeologists have recovered hundreds of unusual human skulls from ancient Paracas burial sites. Around 300 of these remains have been identified with a striking characteristic. Their craniums appear dramatically elongated, extending backward from the forehead in a shape that looks very different from the proportions normally associated with the human skull. The unusual appearance immediately raised questions. How did these people develop such distinctive skull shapes? Was the form created intentionally during childhood? Was it the result of cultural practices, natural variation, or something else entirely? And perhaps most importantly, who were the people behind these extraordinary remains? For decades, these questions have remained at the heart of one of the most controversial discussions surrounding ancient South American archaeology. The modern story began in the early 20th century. In 1925, Peruvian archaeologist Julio C. Tello conducted major excavations on the Paracas Peninsula, investigating important burial complexes, including the sites known as the Paracas Caverns and the Paracas Necropolis. Inside these ancient burial locations, researchers discovered hundreds of individuals carefully wrapped in elaborate textile bundles. Many were accompanied by valuable grave goods, offering archaeologists a rare glimpse into the beliefs, traditions, and social organization of the Paracas culture. Among the discoveries were the distinctive elongated crania that would eventually attract worldwide attention. For nearly a century, these remains have been preserved, examined, and debated by researchers in Peru and around the world. Then, during the 2010s, the controversy entered a new phase. A number of privately organized genetic testing projects began making dramatic claims about the biological origins of the Paracas remains. Some of these claims received enormous attention online, suggesting that the DNA might reveal an unexpected story about the people who lived on the peninsula thousands of years ago. But there was a major problem. Many of those early claims were not supported by the rigorous standards normally required for ancient DNA research. Questions were raised about methodology, sample authentication, contamination, and whether the findings had undergone proper peer review. That distinction is crucial. Ancient DNA research is extraordinarily difficult. Genetic material can degrade over thousands of years, and even small amounts of modern contamination can complicate results. For that reason, scientists rely on strict laboratory procedures, independent verification, and carefully documented methods before drawing conclusions about ancient populations. In the years that followed, researchers began applying increasingly sophisticated genomic techniques to ancient remains, working within the archaeological and cultural framework surrounding the Paracas sites. The result has been a much more complicated picture than the sensational stories often presented online. The central questions now go far beyond the shape of a skull. Who were the Paracas people? How closely were they related to other ancient populations of the Andes? What caused the distinctive cranial shapes found among some individuals? And how much of the modern mythology surrounding the Paracas skulls is actually supported by reliable scientific evidence? These questions have pushed the Paracas Peninsula back into the spotlight. The skulls themselves are unquestionably real. Their unusual morphology is real. And the ancient communities that created this remarkable culture were part of a much larger network of people who inhabited the Pacific coast of South America thousands of years ago. The real mystery is not whether these people existed. It is understanding exactly who they were and what their remains can truly tell us about their origins, their culture, and the society that produced them. The Paracas Peninsula itself is an extraordinary setting for such a mystery. Projecting into the Pacific Ocean like a crooked finger, the peninsula sits within one of the most extreme environments on the Peruvian coast. Cold ocean currents rise from the deep waters offshore, creating an exceptionally productive marine ecosystem. Sea lions gather along the rocky coastline. Huge colonies of seabirds occupy the surrounding cliffs and islands. Over thousands of years, the accumulated remains of these birds produced enormous layers of guano, forming deposits that became a valuable resource for the people who lived in this seemingly barren landscape. It was here, between the desert and the sea, that the Paracas culture developed, and where thousands of years later, archaeologists would uncover evidence that continues to challenge our understanding of ancient South America. The Humboldt Current brings nutrients from the deep, feeding anchovy populations that once numbered in the billions. But the land itself is barren. The Paracas Peninsula receives virtually no rainfall. The coastal desert of southern Peru is one of the driest places on Earth, drier than the Sahara in some measurements, drier than the Atacama to the south. Rain falls perhaps once per decade. The landscape is sand and rock and wind-sculpted ridges that have remained essentially unchanged for thousands of years. This environment preserved what wetter climates would have destroyed. The Paracas people chose this desolate peninsula as their necropolis, their city of the dead. They buried their ancestors in underground chambers carved into the dry earth, wrapped in textiles of extraordinary quality, surrounded by ceramic vessels and tools and offerings that would sustain them in whatever existence followed this one. The bodies mummified naturally. The dry air desiccated the tissues before decay could take hold. Skin, hair, internal organs, all preserved in conditions that would have been impossible in the humid tropics or the rain-soaked highlands. And the skulls preserved too. The elongated crania that would 3,000 years later generate millions of YouTube views and launch 1,000 conspiracy theories, survived intact, their unusual morphology as visible today as it was when the last Paracas priest sealed the burial chambers and walked away. The man who opened those chambers and brought them to scientific attention was himself a remarkable figure. Julio Cesar Tell grew up in poverty in the highland town of Huaracherry, approximately 80 kilometers east of Lima. He was born in 1880 into a Peru that was still recovering from the catastrophic War of the Pacific, into an indigenous Quechua community that occupied the lowest rungs of the nation's rigid social hierarchy. Indigenous Peruvians in 1880 were not expected to become scientists. They were expected to labor in mines on haciendas in domestic service to occupy the same subordinate position their ancestors had occupied since the Spanish conquest 3.5 centuries earlier. T refused this expectation. He displayed exceptional academic ability from childhood. Local benefactors recognized his potential and helped fund his education. He earned a medical degree from the Universidad Nacional Mayor de San Marcos, the oldest university in the Americas. He traveled to the United States and earned a master's degree in anthropology from Harvard University in 1911. He returned to Peru as his nation's first professionally trained archaeologist, and as an indigenous man determined to document the achievements of his own ancestors on their own terms. T rejected the prevailing archaeological narratives of his era. European and American archaeologists had long attributed the sophisticated civilizations of ancient Peru to outside influences, to migrations from Asia, to lost tribes of Israel, to any origin other than the indigenous peoples themselves. T insisted that the great civilizations of the Andes were indigenous creations. He spent his career documenting the evidence, the Chavan culture of the northern highlands, the Paracas culture of the southern coast, the complex societies that had flourished for millennia before the Inca, and that the Inca themselves had built upon. When T began excavating the Paracas burial sites in 1925, he was not looking for mysteries. He was looking for ancestors. He found them. The Paracas Sivera site contained burial chambers carved into the bedrock bottle-shaped tombs, accessed through narrow shafts containing the bundled remains of multiple individuals interred over generations. The Paracas necropolis site was even more elaborate. A vast underground complex containing over 400 mummy bundles, each wrapped in layers of textile that represented years of skilled labor. The textiles were extraordinary, T recognized immediately that he was looking at some of the finest fabric ever produced by human hands. The Paracas weavers had developed techniques that European textile traditions would not match for another 2,000 years. They produced cloth with thread counts approaching 500 per inch, finer than anything available in modern department stores. They embroidered designs of such complexity that individual garments represented thousands of hours of skilled work. They created colors, deep reds, brilliant yellows, luminous blues using natural dyes derived from plants, insects, and minerals, applied through processes that modern chemists have struggled to replicate. A single Paracas burial mantle might contain more than 100 individual embroidered figures, supernatural beings, masked humans, animals, geometric patterns, each rendered with meticulous attention to detail, each contributing to iconographic programs whose meanings we can only partially reconstruct. The textiles alone would have established the Paracas as one of the great artistic cultures of the ancient Americas. But it was the skulls that captured public attention. Tell documented the elongated crania carefully. He measured them, he photographed them, he classified them according to the degree and style of modification. He understood what he was seeing. The practice of intentional cranial modification was already well documented in the archaeological and ethnographic literature of T's era. Hippocrates had described it in the 5th century BC, writing about peoples who bound the heads of their infants to produce elongated skulls as marks of noble status. Spanish colonial observers had documented the practice among various indigenous American peoples. Physical anthropologists had studied modified skulls from cultures across the globe. T recognized the Paracas elongated skulls as products of the same widespread human cultural practice, not as biological anomalies requiring supernatural explanation. The mechanism of cranial modification is straightforward. The human skull at birth consists of separate bones connected by fibrous tissue. The bones are not yet fused. The skull is malleable. During the first months and years of life, as the brain grows and the skull expands to accommodate it, external pressure can redirect that growth. Boards bound against the forehead and back of the head will cause the skull to grow upward and backward rather than outward. Tight wrappings around the circumference of the head will produce a different shape. The specific apparatus determines the specific result. Different cultures developed different techniques producing different characteristic shapes, but all were variants of the same underlying process. The modification is permanent. Once the cranial sutures fuse and the bones oiphy, typically by early childhood, the modified shape is fixed for life. The practice was widespread in the ancient Andes. The Paracas were not unique. The later Tiwanaku culture of the Lake Titicaca Basin practiced cranial modification. The Wari culture of the Central Highlands practiced it. The Inca themselves practiced it, though to a lesser degree than their predecessors. The tradition persisted for over 2,000 years across the Andean world. It marked identity. Different shapes corresponded to different ethnic groups, different communities, different social statuses. The modification was a visible, permanent, inescapable marker of who you were and where you belonged. You could not remove it. You could not hide it. You carried your identity on your head for your entire life. Tiffany Tung, the Vanderbilt University bioarchaeologist who has spent her career studying pre-Columbian Andean populations, has documented the social dimensions of cranial modification in the Wari culture. Her research demonstrates that the practice was not random. Specific shapes correlated with specific geographic origins. Individuals buried in Wari administrative centers came from diverse regions, and their skull shapes revealed their origins as clearly as any passport. The practice was a technology of identity in a world before written records, before photography, before any of the documentation systems that modern states use to track their populations. Your skull shape told the world who your people were. The Paracas practiced cranial modification with particular intensity. The elongation achieved in some Paraca skulls is among the most extreme documented anywhere in the world. The visual effect is dramatic, almost alien in appearance to modern eyes accustomed to unmodified human skulls. This dramatic appearance is precisely what made the Paracas skulls attractive to alternative archaeology promoters. The alternative archaeology narrative emerged in the early 2010s. Brian Forrester, a Canadian author and tour operator who had relocated to Peru, became the most prominent voice promoting the idea that the Paracas skulls were not products of cultural modification, but evidence of something else entirely. Forrester operated the Paracas History Museum, a private institution distinct from Peru's official cultural heritage system, and cultivated relationships with collectors and local officials that gave him access to skull specimens. His claims escalated over time. The skulls were too elongated to be explained by binding alone. The cranial volume was too large. The bone structure was somehow different. Something other than ordinary cultural modification must be responsible. In 2014, Forrester announced that he had arranged for genetic testing of Paracas skull samples. The testing was conducted through channels outside the mainstream academic system. The geneticist who performed the initial analysis remained anonymous. The results, Forrester claimed, showed mitochondrial DNA sequences that did not match any known human haplogroup. The implication, never stated explicitly, but unmistakably suggested, was that the Paracas skulls might not be fully human. The announcement generated enormous online engagement. Videos and articles about the mysterious Paracas DNA accumulated tens of millions of views. The narrative fit perfectly into the alternative archaeology ecosystem, a world in which mainstream science is perpetually covering up evidence of ancient mysteries, lost civilizations, and non-human influences on human history. Lloyd Pye, an American author who had promoted similar claims about the Starchild skull, a deformed human cranium from Mexico that Pye attributed to alien-human hybridization, supported the Paracas claims before his death in 2013. The Starchild skull has since been definitively identified through DNA analysis as the remains of a human child who suffered from hydrocephalus, a congenital condition that causes fluid accumulation in the brain and resultant skull deformation. The DNA was human. The condition was medical. The mystery was manufactured. The Paracas claims followed a similar trajectory. Dramatic initial announcements, enormous popular engagement, and systematic scientific reputation that received a fraction of the attention. The problems with the 2014 genetic testing were fundamental. Ancient DNA analysis is extraordinarily difficult. DNA degrades over time. It fragments into shorter and shorter pieces. It accumulates chemical damage that can cause sequencing errors. It is easily contaminated by modern DNA from anyone who has handled the remains: archaeologists, museum curators, collectors, even bacteria that colonize the bones after death. Extracting usable genetic information from remains that are thousands of years old requires specialized facilities with extreme contamination controls, rigorous authentication protocols, and analytical techniques specifically designed to work with damaged and fragmentary ancient DNA. The 2014 Paracas testing met none of these standards. The samples were not collected under controlled conditions. The chain of custody was unclear. The laboratory protocols were not documented. The results were not submitted for peer review. The claim that the DNA did not match any known HLO group was misleading at best. Mitochondrial HLO groups are classification systems developed by geneticists to organize human genetic diversity. DNA that does not immediately match a known HLO group classification is not necessarily non-human. It may represent a haplogroup that has not been previously characterized. Entirely possible for ancient populations that have never been systematically sampled. It may represent contamination, modern DNA from handlers mixing with ancient DNA from the remains. It may represent sequencing errors, misread bases caused by chemical damage to the ancient DNA. The leap from unusual preliminary results to evidence of non-human origin was scientifically unjustified. But scientific justification was never the point. The point was engagement, attention, and the perpetuation of a narrative that positioned mainstream science as the enemy of truth. The actual scientific community has now responded. The past decade has seen a revolution in ancient DNA research. New extraction techniques can recover genetic material from remains that were previously considered too degraded to analyze. New sequencing technologies can read millions of DNA fragments simultaneously. New analytical methods can distinguish genuine ancient DNA from modern contamination with unprecedented accuracy. The Lundbeck Foundation Geogenetics Center in Copenhagen, led by Eske Willerslev, has been at the forefront of this revolution. Willerslev's laboratory has recovered DNA from remains tens of thousands of years old, including Neanderthals, Denisovans, and the earliest modern humans to reach the Americas. The standards his laboratory has established for ancient DNA authentication have become the benchmark for the field. Lars Fehren Schmitz, a paleogeneticist at UC Santa Cruz, has applied these methods specifically to pre-Columbian Andean populations. His laboratory has analyzed hundreds of ancient individuals from across the Andean world, establishing the population history of the region with unprecedented resolution. The 2017 research papers, produced in collaboration with David Reich's laboratory at Harvard, comprehensive genomic studies incorporating data from ancient South American populations, established the framework within which all Andean ancient DNA must now be understood. The research was conducted properly. The samples were collected under controlled conditions with authorization from the Peruvian Ministry of Culture. The analyses were performed in laboratories with stringent contamination controls. The results were subjected to peer review and published in leading scientific journals, and the results were unambiguous. The Paracas people were indigenous Americans. Their mitochondrial DNA belongs to haplogroups A, B, C, and D. The founding lineages that entered the Americas during the initial human migration from Asia at the end of the last ice age. Their Y chromosome DNA belongs to haplogroup Q, the predominant male lineage in indigenous American populations. Their autosomal DNA, the genetic material inherited from both parents that provides the most comprehensive picture of ancestry, shows clear affinity with other ancient and modern Andean populations. The Paracas people were the ancestors of the Quechua and Aymara peoples who still inhabit the Andean region today. They were human beings. They practiced a documented human cultural tradition. Their elongated skulls were products of intentional modification. The same practice documented in cultures from Central Asia to Central Africa to pre-Columbian Mesoamerica. The DNA proves it. John Verono, the Tulane University physical anthropologist who has spent decades studying Andean bioarchaeology, has examined Paracas skulls directly. His analysis confirms what Giulitello understood a century ago. The skulls show the characteristic features of intentional cranial modification: flattening where the binding apparatus pressed against the bone, compensatory bulging where the growing skull expanded to accommodate the pressure. The modification does not change the underlying anatomy. The same bones are present in modified and unmodified skulls. The sutures are in the same positions. The foramina, the holes through which nerves and blood vessels pass, are where they should be. The difference is shape, not structure. The increased cranial volume that some observers have noted is a predictable consequence of the modification process. When you compress a skull in one dimension, it expands in others. The total volume may increase slightly, but this is a mechanical effect of the reshaping, not evidence of a larger brain or non-human origin. The brain inside a modified skull is a normal human brain. The person carrying that skull was a normal human being. Their appearance was modified. Their humanity was not. The implications of the actual DNA evidence extend far beyond the reputation of alternative archaeology claims. The genetic data establishes something far more significant. Continuity. The Paracas people were not a lost civilization that disappeared without trace. They were the ancestors of living peoples. The Quechua communities of the Peruvian highlands and coast, the Aymara communities of the Lake Titicaca Basin, the millions of indigenous South Americans who still speak languages, descended from pre-Columbian tongues, who still practice cultural traditions with roots extending back millennia, who still inhabit the same lands their ancestors inhabited 3,000 years ago. The DNA proves the connection. The genetic signatures present in Paracas remains are present in their modern descendants. The population did not disappear. The population persisted through the rise and fall of the Nazca, the Wari, the Tiwanaku, the Inca, through the catastrophe of Spanish conquest, through 5 centuries of colonial and post-colonial transformation. They are still here. The elongated skulls are not relics of a vanished race. They are the remains of someone's great-great-great-grandparents repeated 100 generations back. Ancestors whose descendants still walk the same coastal deserts, still fish the same rich Pacific waters, still carry the genetic heritage that the ancient DNA analysis has now documented. The alternative archaeology narrative erases this continuity. By attributing the Paracas skulls to non-human origins, to alien intervention, to anything other than the actual indigenous peoples who created them, the narrative denies indigenous Peruvians credit for their own history. It says implicitly that the remarkable achievements of ancient Andean civilization, the textiles, the architecture, the agricultural systems, the social organization, must have come from somewhere else. For some, the very existence of these remarkable remains has been used to suggest that indigenous people could not have created such achievements by themselves, but that idea is not new, and it is certainly not neutral. Throughout history, similar arguments have been directed at extraordinary monuments and accomplishments created by non-European societies. The pyramids of Egypt, the stone structures of Great Zimbabwe, and the monumental earthworks of ancient North America have all at different times been attributed to mysterious outsiders, rather than to the people who actually built them. Sometimes the supposed explanation involves aliens, sometimes it involves a fictional lost civilization, and sometimes it simply assumes that someone else must have been responsible. The pattern is deeply familiar. When an ancient achievement seems too impressive to fit a particular historical narrative, the accomplishments of indigenous peoples are questioned before their own abilities are. But the archaeological and genetic evidence tells a different story. The Paracas remains are human. The people who carried these distinctive skull shapes were indigenous Americans. Their society developed in the Andes, and their extraordinary accomplishments were products of their own knowledge, skill, and cultural traditions. The textiles that survived for thousands of years were created by their artisans. The elaborate burial complexes were constructed through their labor. And the practice of cranial modification was a cultural tradition carried out within their own communities, most likely beginning during childhood and continuing as part of social identity, family tradition, status, or belonging. There is no scientific need to introduce mysterious outsiders to explain any of it. The evidence points to something far more grounded, and in many ways far more remarkable. Human beings did this. A century ago, archaeologists such as Julio C. Tello worked to document the achievements of the ancient peoples of Peru through systematic archaeological research. His work helped establish the importance of the Paracas culture within the broader history of the Andes. Modern scientific research has continued that effort. The genetic evidence supports the conclusion that the Paracas population belonged to the indigenous peoples of ancient South America and was connected to the broader population history of the Andes. Their story is not one of mysterious visitors or an unknown civilization appearing from nowhere. It is the story of an indigenous society that developed its own traditions, technologies, artistic achievements, and beliefs. That distinction matters because sensational stories about the Paracas skulls have often overshadowed the people themselves. Dramatic claims spread widely across the internet, while careful archaeological research received far less attention. In the process, the real heritage of the Paracas people was sometimes pushed into the background. The remarkable truth is already enough. Human societies around the world have practiced intentional cranial modification. Archaeologists have documented the tradition across different regions and time periods, showing that communities sometimes deliberately shape the skulls of infants and children as part of their cultural identity. The Paracas were part of that larger human story. Their achievements also belong to a much wider history of indigenous innovation in the Andes, from the extraordinary textiles of Paracas to the monumental Nazca geoglyphs, from the administrative systems of later Andean civilizations to the vast Inca road network. These accomplishments were created by indigenous societies with their own knowledge and ingenuity, and their descendants did not simply disappear. Indigenous communities continue to live across the Andes today, maintaining languages, traditions, and cultural connections to the civilizations that came before them. That is why the Paracas skulls matter, not because they prove something supernatural, not because they require an unknown civilization to explain them, and not because they represent a mystery that can only be solved by abandoning established archaeology. They matter because they reveal something about real people who lived thousands of years ago, and whose story has too often been distorted by sensationalism. The evidence points to a clear conclusion. The skulls are human. The people were indigenous and the culture was their own. The supposed mystery was never as mysterious as the headlines suggested. The answers were always present in the archaeological record, in the work of researchers, and increasingly, in the genetic evidence. 3,000 years ago, on a remote and windswept peninsula along the Peruvian coast, families lived, worked, created, and raised their children according to traditions that shaped their identity. They produced extraordinary textiles. They built elaborate places to honor their dead. They buried their ancestors with ceremony and care. And according to cultural traditions whose full meanings we can only partially reconstruct today, they intentionally shaped the heads of some of their children. Eventually, those children became adults. They lived their lives. They died. And their communities preserved their memory through elaborate burials that survived beneath the desert for thousands of years. Today, their descendants are still here. Their DNA connects the ancient past to living populations, and their legacy remains visible in the history and culture of the Andes. That is the real story behind the elongated skulls of Paracas. It is not a story about aliens, lost civilizations, or mysterious outsiders. It is a story about human beings, and about an indigenous civilization whose achievements were extraordinary precisely because they were human. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson of all. We do not need to invent a mystery to make the Paracas people remarkable. Their own story is remarkable enough.